Good day everyone, so we're going to be talking a bit about Nilou and the Gorou argument, which is something that I've been seeing pop up in so many of not just my own videos comments, but like everywhere on the internet. I don't know who originated, and this is certainly not an attack on whoever made it. This is just to sort of clarify a principle that I think a lot of people making this argument kind of miss. So the Gorou argument goes like this. Basically, Gorou has a passive whereby if you press his elemental burst, then the entire party, or all the party members, have their defense increased by 25% for about 12 seconds. So this is Gorou's passive, and the argument is that if Gorou was taken out of a mono geo team, then he would still retain his function, or his passive's function, in a different team that you'd slot him in. And Nilou's not the same. If you take her out of a pure Dendro Hydro sort of hybrid team comp, then her function ceases, and therefore it is bad design. Now, there are a number of problems with trying to view Nilou in this way, and I think the biggest one is when you sort of take characters and that have certain passive abilities and you put them in another team, the question is not whether that passive exists, but whether putting that character in its totality in a new team actually makes sense. So if you put your Gorou from a mono geo team and you put him into the national team, did this actually accomplish anything? Like, did your team actually improve their damage, the overall DPS output? Well, not really. You've actually made the team a lot worse by including him. So regardless of whether his passive exists or can still be used, you've made a far more greater tactical error. And this is the key thing to understand. If I take Nilou outside of her bountiful core team that can generate bountiful cores, and I put her into a freeze team where she's not generating any cores, in other words, a freeze team with no dendro units to trigger any cores of any kind, then the argument is, did I make such a bad tactical decision? Was it such a huge downgrade? And I know a lot of people might say, well, you can do better, just slot in a Kokomi or a Xingqiu or whatever, some other Hydro unit of your choice. And the answer is, well, that's not the correct way to think about it, because let's go back to the Gorou example. What was the problem of putting Gorou into something like the national team? That is, your team's overall efficiency kind of dropped down significantly. So here's the question: to what degree did your team's efficiency drop from having moved Nilou into it? In other words, is there a way, like we do with weapons, where we can actually sort of quantify different teams and their relative efficiency to one another in some sort of ranking system and determine, like, oh yeah, perhaps this Nilou team is not too bad after all. What I mean by this is, you could, let's say, take a meta team and say this team represents 100% power because its effective DPS output is, say, 60k DPS per second, and these other teams would rank like below it, and in order for you to clear the Spiral Abyss, you need about 70%. So your team needs to set at 70% of the power of a meta team in order to consistently and comfortably clear the Spiral Abyss. And if the team that has now Nilou in it actually then achieves, let's say, 85% on the score, instead of, let's say, 95% because of another Hydro unit, then honestly, that should be then regarded as good enough. It should be regarded as functional enough regardless of her passive. If you can say, look, I'm going to take Nilou, I'm going to put her in a vaporized team, and she sort of ranks now at 80% of the efficiency that you need, then yeah, that is still good enough. If we put her in Hyperbloom or whatever teams where her passive doesn't function as it would in her niche, then yeah, we can then sort of understand more or less what the trade-offs are of putting this character and using her outside her niche. And very similarly, we can then also then say, well, what happens if we do use just a Hydrodendro sort of team? Where does the Nilou then sit on this ranking? Is she sitting at 110% of the meta teams, like power or whatever? And in this sense, you can get a very good sense of what the actual impact is and whether the loss of this passive is actually so significant, such that we can make now the argument that, yeah, she was a bit too restricted or not. Once again, it all comes down to actually putting down the numbers, because once you have the numbers for these things, you will realize that, yeah, perhaps Nilou is not that bad. And the reason I'm making this argument is because I've certainly seen it from my own and from many others playtesting Nilou outside of just the pure Hydrodendro team comps. And yeah, that is pretty much what I've got to say in terms of that argument. The next argument that I want to make is why her nicheness is actually kind of okay, And this is the other thing that a lot of people seem to sweep under the rug. So if you take a character like Ayaka, for instance, you'll notice that a lot of people will tend to play her in freeze teams in very much the same way where people tend to play Hu Tao in vaporized teams, and most notably Hu Tao is typically played with a shielder and Xing Shu most typically. It's the same with Xiangling. She is almost wedded to Bennett, and I know very few people can actually play Sukokumon successfully, so typically you only find Xiangling with Bennett, which in a certain sense is a restriction on its own as well. Not saying that you can't play these characters outside of these niches, but there seems to be a gravitation towards playing certain characters in certain styles. I think that's kind of the argument I'm trying to make here. And what you then find is that it's very unusual to take these characters too far out of these styles. So for instance, you won't take Xiangling and Bennett, both of them, and then suddenly now put them into a Burgeon type team. It's just not going to work. That's why you have characters like Toma. But notwithstanding, the point here is perhaps it's not that weird to think of certain characters having preferable play styles, for instance like Nilou in a Hydrodendro sort of team comp, and understanding that, yeah, that is sort of the play styles that you're going to sort of use her in. And obviously with the release of more and more Dendro characters and so on, you will then have different ways of play of sort of affecting that play style, and perhaps different rotations and so on. And of course this, I think, fits very naturally in with Genshin Impact, and certainly in the way that people talk about teams. People talk about a taser team, a melt team, and so on, and this is just fitting that language. You know, we've got hyper bloom teams, we've got aggregate teams. Why not have bountiful core teams? And we will have bountiful core teams that each have their strengths. Once we get more Dendro units, it's kind of unfair to judge sort of the element when you only have literally 3 Dendro units, whereas I think if we had 10 Dendro units, the picture would obviously become much more clearer and so on. And honestly, in Genshin Impact, it's not that unnatural to think of certain team comps requiring certain essential units. For instance, a freeze requires you to have Hydro and Cryo. Yes, you can put in an Anemo unit, you can of course put in a Pyro unit, but these are tactical choices that you'll make, and very often these sort of tactical choices, whilst they may seem like, you know, you have now access to more and more characters, but in practice the answer is typically just use Sucrose or Kazuha, because you can VV shred and you can infuse the sort of cryo elements. But the other units, Xiao, Sayu, Jean, and I think even Heizo himself, doesn't really seem sort of, they don't see the light of day when it comes to playing. And certainly in the melt teams, you don't see people very often just throwing in casually the Luke or Klee or Yoimiya, for instance. The point being that just because you have access to other units does not mean that you're going to fully utilize all of those other units. And I think this is the sort of part that is kind of overplayed by a lot of people. Nonetheless, the most important thing about Nilou for me is the fact that she is Hydro, and Hydro plays very nicely with all of the elements, of course, Geo being the odd one out, and Hydro units are always premium units because of the fact that they can fit into so many different teams. And I do think that without the ability to generate these bountiful cores, if Nilou was instead like a much more generic Hydro unit, she would be a lot more forgettable, because a lot of the times on the internet and so on, I rarely see people mention Ayato. And I think this is a consequence of his character design, because he doesn't stand for he doesn't really stand for anything, and he's very easily sort of overtaken in certain niches by either, you know, putting in a Yelon or a Shinshu or a Kokomi or a Mona. And this is kind of the problem of a character like that, whereas Nilou herself, whilst still being able to fulfill the Hydro role for a lot of teams, also has something that she sort of stands for, and that character identity, I think, is what makes her such a beautiful character.